Right, welcome. Thank you for joining us today in person and online. I'm Melissa Barnett. I'm the director of the Francis McClelland Institute for Children, Youth, and Families, or FMI, as we refer to ourselves. And we are having a technical challenge. So we are so glad you could join us today for the talk Social Support as Kindness, Properties of Helpful Emotional Support Messages. And before we get started with today's talk, I do, first of all, hope that if this is your first time joining an FMI event, it won't be your last. You will join us. We have 3 more events planned for this semester, all coming up next month. I also want to take this moment to share what was the land acknowledgement of the University of Arizona. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous people. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'atham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education, offerings, partnerships, and community service. And this is in line with our goals at FMI to connect the work that we're doing here at the university to the real lives of people in the community. In general, here at the Francis McClelland Institute, our goal is to work collaboratively to build opportunities for children, youth, and families, especially those experiencing adversity, to thrive. We do this by supporting innovative research, actively partnering with community organizations, sharing research findings with practitioners and the community, and educating the next generation of engaged scholars and leaders. We are also really proud that part of our work includes the Science of Kindness Community Collective.
Great. Thank you for letting us say a few words. We're thrilled to have Dr. Steve Rains with us today. The work that we do with the Science of Kindness Community Collective starts in the community with us asking the question, how do people even conceive kindness? If this was a very, very kind place, how would we know it? What would we see? What would we hear? What would we notice? And from gathering all of this data, one of the kinds of kindness, one of the categories of kindness that emerges is social support. So we asked Steve to come, Dr. Rains to come and talk about the work that he does, because we also know that if we are going to do kindness well, if we're going to produce social support messages that are received well by people, we need to know how to do it. We need to have skills. And so Dr. Rains' research is some of the most relevant in this area right now, as we're so lucky to have him here. He was also on my committee when I did my PhD just recently. So Steve, thanks so much for being here.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Two more things before we turn it over to you. I do want to acknowledge that all of the work that we do honors the legacy of Francis McClelland, who lived a life that facilitated and represented resilience. She was a tireless advocate. And I want to tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. So just take a moment here to tell you a little bit about Francis McClelland. She was the child of Irish immigrants, and at the time, the Irish were an immigrant group that faced significant discrimination. This helped solidify her commitment to ensuring opportunities for immigrant families. She contracted polio as a child and had lifelong physical disabilities. She did not let this hold her back, but again, it solidified her commitment to making opportunities available for other individuals with disabilities. Frances is a University of Arizona alum. She received her bachelor's degree in business at a time when this was very uncommon for women, again, solidifying her commitment to creating educational opportunities for others. She went on to serve in corporate roles for her family's company, Shamrock Foods at the time, shattering glass ceilings, again, solidifying her commitment to creating opportunity for women to achieve. Frances' support of the University of Arizona, including the Francis McClelland Institute, also underscores her commitment to research. She believed in the power of research and science to help inform strategies that we could use to ensure that children, youth, and families have the opportunity to reach their full potential. Grateful to Frances. We are also grateful to another well-known, generous alum, and that is Pam Turbeville, who we hope is joining us today. So thank you very much to Pam for supporting this speaker series. And finally, we will turn it over to Dr. Rains. Dr. Steve Rains is a professor of communication at the U of A. He earned his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. His research is situated in the areas of health communication, social influence, communication, and technology. He is interested in better understanding how and why messages influence people, particularly in health contexts and when using communication technologies. His work in recent years, which I'll share today, has primarily focused on social support. He is especially interested in leveraging computational social science techniques to explore the dynamic communication processes. So Ben, thank you for joining us today. And if you are joining us online, go ahead, if you have questions, go and you can put them in the Q&A. We'll have time at the end for questions and answers. Thanks.
Thank you all for the opportunity to share some of my work with you. I'm really excited to talk about social support and its connections to kindness. And so what I thought I'd do is start out by providing a little bit of a foundation, some of the shoulders that I stand on in my own work, and then we would do a deep dive into some of the things that my research team and I have been studying related to social support. So social support, then, supportive communication and kindness share quite a bit of overlap. They're both pro-social behaviors. Kindness, Dr. Mare is defined as intentional and voluntary action performed with sensitivity to the needs or desires of another person and directed toward fostering well-being. So I kind of think of kindness as a broad series of actions designed to help others and make others feel better. Support within that is a little bit more focused in scope. And in terms of communication, it's verbal and nonverbal behaviors designed to help others in need. So you can give support without being kind, and you certainly can be kind without giving support, but there is a lot of overlap between these constructs. And so what I thought I would do today is talk about what we've learned about communication and social support and see what kind of lessons we can draw for the study of kindness. So social support is studied all over this campus and in different ways, right? Some people study properties of social networks, some people study interventions. What we study in comm is messages and the messages people produce to give support. And so oftentimes those are thought about as things like, I give you advice, for example, is a common type. There's also instrumental support, which is doing something for someone. I take you to the doctor, or you loan me money, let's say. What I focus on primarily is emotional support, which involves helping people cope with their feelings and negative feelings in particular. And so within that literature, there's a construct called person-centeredness. And person-centeredness is really the jumping off point for my research. It's the springboard from which all of my work is driven forward. And so it involves adapting to the cognitive, affective, relational aspects of a communication context. That's the conceptual definition. We're kind of meeting people where they are and trying to help them understand their feelings. It's operationalized, though, in three very concrete ways. There's typically three levels. Low is denying and criticizing someone's feelings. It's not helpful, but it happens. Moderate is implicitly recognizing feelings, and then high, which is what we aim for, is when you explicitly validate someone's feelings. All right, so who has someone they care about? Everyone. I knew it. Just looking at you all, this is a group that I think brings a lot of light into the world, so it's not surprising. So imagine you tell someone that you care about that you're really upset about what happened, right? They can respond in a number of different ways. A low person-centered response would be like, well, you're overreacting about the whole thing. Don't worry about it. So what we have going on there is your feelings are being denied. You're overreacting. Your feelings are illegitimate. Moderate person-centeredness, I can't believe that happened. I'm sorry to hear that. So there's some recognition that you've got some distress going on, but it doesn't explicitly tackle it. High person-centeredness is you have every right to be upset. That was not normal. So here we're recognizing that you are upset and then validating those feelings. You notice I put the word count because the word count is constant, right? What's different is the rhetorical moves within those three different actions. And so I know some of you might be thinking, who gives low person-centered support? But I would argue it's common, and it's even more common among people who are close to us. Like if you ever go to like a family reunion or a family party, just listen to the way people talk to one another. you'll hear things like, "You're overreacting. Don't worry about it." And it's not that people are cruel or mean. I just think they don't know how to provide a support effectively. So in the support research, Jim Dillard and Andy High did a meta-analysis. And a meta-analysis is just a quantitative literature review. They basically took K as the number of studies. They found 23 studies looking at the effects of person-centeredness on outcomes. And what they did is they looked at the relationship between those two variables across all 23 studies. They aggregate it in kind of like a mean, and the effect size, which ranges from 0 to 1 in this case, and you can read that as a Pearson correlation, is 0.61. 0.61 is massive, massive. I wouldn't be surprised if we run around this building and said, "Have you ever seen an effect size of 0.61? And that 9 out of 10 people would say, "No, not in my own research." It's huge. It's the 4th biggest effect size in all of I looked at 140 meta-analyses from the beginnings to 2015. This was the 4th biggest. It is massive. And so the reason I bring that up is because what it suggests to me is that this is really a potent message feature in terms of helping people feel better or worse about their feelings. So that's our jumping off point. What I'd like to do then is do a little bit of a deep dive on some of the work I've been doing with my research team over in COM, and talk about 3 different trajectories or 3 different lines of work we've been doing. 1 examines the scope and mechanisms. So why does it work? What are its limits? 2, how does person-centeredness come out of interaction? So we're really interested in actual conversation and talk and how it emerges. And last but not least, we're going to look at some stuff that we've been doing recently that involves support provision online as a collective phenomenon. I would be remiss if I didn't mention all of my excellent collaborators: Chelsea Akers, Anjali Ashtraputri, Joe Benito, Shelby Carter, Bethany Lutovsky, Kat Nemkova, Corey Pavlich, Eric Tetsi. Everyone except for Joe Benito was one of my current or former grad students, and Joe Benito is my colleague, and he's also a stats whiz. And he helped with the second set of projects. Okay. So the scope and mechanisms, what brings about the effects of person-centeredness? There's a theory called the theory of conversationally induced reappraisals. And the premise of that theory is that when people talk about their feelings, if it's done correctly, they reappraise those feelings and they see them in a different way. So they either see their distress as being more manageable or their resources to handle it as being more adaptive or effective. And so there have only been a very few tests of this, and one of them was Jones did this really nice study with her student John Wirtz, brought people into a lab. They had Confederates randomly assigned to give out high, low, or moderate support. Here's the path model they tested. The idea was person-centeredness PC leads to talk about feelings, positive emotion words in this case, which leads to reappraisal, which leads to emotional improvement. And you can see they found that significant kind of indirect effect, suggesting that, yeah, that must be what's happening here. People are talking about their feelings, that leads them to feel better, or that leads them to think about their stressor in a different way and then ultimately feel better. One thing that stood out to our team, though, is that bottom direct effect. We have graduate students here, right? Did you know this is going to be interactive? You're thrilled, aren't you? So, you do quantitative work. Who does quantitative work? Few of you. You do. So you've got a significant indirect effect up top, but when that's in the model, that direct effect is still significant, right? What does that tell you? Does reappraisal and positive emotions explain everything in the effects of person-centeredness on emotional improvement? No, right? It doesn't. It means there's something still going on in person-centeredness that explains why people are improving. And so what we wanted to do is figure out what that was. And one of the things we hypothesized was it's something much more simple. It's just validation. There's not a lot, but there's some literature in psych that shows that when people feel like their feelings are legitimized or validated, that makes them feel better. And you can think about that. You feel upset and someone says, well, yeah, you're upset. You have every right to be upset. It's reasonable that you're upset. That makes you feel a little bit better. And so we wanted to test that mechanism. The other thing we wanted to do is push the scope of this theory. And the people who came up with the theory of conversationally induced reappraisals, Burleson and Goldsmith, they've got this claim, and they said that there are no magic bullet words and phrases that will reliably bring about relief to victims of emotional distress. I don't know, my team was like 0.63 is that effect size. That's, I don't know, I bet you we could come up with some generic things that if framed in the form of high person-centeredness would be more helpful than low person-centeredness. I don't know. So we want to test that. And so the way we did that is we thought, well, what if we could remove the person from person centeredness and give people generic support messages? And so what we did is we conducted a series of experiments with what we created was a chatbot. I'll explain how that worked in just a second. But the idea would be people came into the lab, interacted with our chatbot, they were asked a series of questions and they received either low or high person-centered feedback. And then before and after they rated their emotional distress and completed some other items. So we had 234, this was just undergrads. No, this one was through Prolific. So this was people out in the world. And let me show you, this is ListenerBot. Now, the human computer interaction people, they try to make the most human-like chatbots as possible, right? The idea is let's make them as human-like as we can. We wanted to go the other direction. We wanted to make it as chatbot-y as possible, as artificial as possible, because we wanted people to think it was artificial. So let me just start up ListenerBot here. You can see it really is we were going for like the lowest quality technology possible. And in fact, it's not even really a chatbot. It's just a series of PowerPoint slides, and later we used some CSS script. So what happened was people entered they were told they're going to interact with a chatbot. And then ListenerBot asked them a series of 5 questions about their problems. So they talked about problems related to academics. They could choose academics, personal relationships, finances. And so the first prompt was, I'm here to listen to your problems. Can you please tell me about your problem? What's going on? So they typed their response and clicked proceed. So they were randomly assigned to get either high PC or low PC feedback. I'm going to show you an example of both. High PC, I'm sorry to hear about your troubles. This sounds like a difficult situation. I see why it would be stressful. So we're acknowledging people's feelings and legitimizing those feelings. Low PC, this does not seem like something to get worked up about. You are an adult and should know that things like this can happen. So we're criticizing your feelings. So this went on over a series of 5 question answer cycles. How does the situation make you feel? High PC was, I completely understand why you would feel that way. I bet this will be a learning experience that you'll benefit from in the future. So what you can see there is happening in the second half is they're trying to encourage reappraisal. Like, yeah, it's tough now, but if you look at it from a different light, it's going to be better. It's going to make you better. Low PC, it seems like you're overreacting or exaggerating. You seem like someone who tends to be overly sensitive.
That was super helpful.
Yeah, and unfortunately, yeah, some messages appear. And so what we wanted to see then is these are generic messages. We had a whole bank of these and we rotated them through and changed the order and tried to do everything we could to make sure there was no message, no effect related to the experimental situation. And what we found is that, you know what, the effects of VPC do generalize, or PC, I'm sorry, do generalize to these generic messages. We found greater reappraisal in the high PC condition. We found greater distress reduction, and we saw greater validation. I want to point out the effect size for distress reduction was only 0.14, which is a lot smaller than 0.63, but there are only 2 other experiments where they actually had human interaction, and those effect sizes were about 0.21. So it still shows that even in this very contrived, generic setting, these high person-centered messages work better than the low person-centered. So what about the mechanisms? On the top here, we have basically, well, let's start on the left. We have our exogenous variable as person-centeredness. Our mediators on top are like talk really the nature of their talk, the nature of their emotion words they used in responses, or cognitive mechanism words, which is like realize, understand. Didn't really matter all that much. What we found was that person-centeredness led to feelings of validation, which led to reappraisal, which led to distress reduction. So this validated feelings mechanism seemed to explain the effects of person-centeredness on distress reduction. And then I know what you want to know. Well, maybe not, but I'm going to tell you anyway. So this, what about the top path, the direct path? Once these mediators are included, it is no longer significant. So again, this is not a human interaction per se, but it does offer evidence that these effects generalize and that validation plays a pretty critical role. So then we replicated this. We had a couple of studies in our initial study. Then we did a follow-ups where we manipulated other things. We basically found the same thing every time. We found that there are magic bullet words and phrases that reliably bring about relief from emotional distress. And I see this as valuable because if somebody needs skills training, you can just give them, here are some things you can do, or better yet, here are some things you cannot do that would be helpful. We also found that, I think we found that validation plays a pretty important role as a theoretical mechanism in explaining the effects of person-centeredness. So if I move on so that's one set of studies. If we talk about a second set, what we've been trying to do is looking at person-centeredness in the context of conversation. So this starts from some of the research in comm where we've always been interested in conversation, but quantitatively it's been very hard to study because it's messy, right? You think about conversation, it's, I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk. So you've got data that are both longitudinal and dyadic, and it's like, whoa, what do we do with that? And so it's created some significant challenges, but also opportunities as well. And so one of the things my team and I have been interested in is how do supportive conversations unfold through this interdependent behavior of seekers and providers. So a lot of the research on support right now in comm looks at the effects of messages. And so we're really focused on message properties. And it's really almost like a one-way phenomenon. I give you a kind of support. How does that make you feel? What we've always wondered, though, is like, what about support seekers? And how do seekers determine the kind of support they receive? So if I talk about my problem in a different way, do I get a different kind of support from you? And then how does that support affect what I say? And so what we're trying to do is capture this idea of support coming out of interactions as people, and rather than seeing them as like things that's being exchanged, but like people working to co-construct meaning through talk. And so at the heart of all these studies is the idea of a speaking turn, and a speaking turn is uninterrupted speech. So I say something, that's one turn, you respond, that's another turn, I say something, that's another turn, and so on and so forth. So what we did is we did a series of studies where we brought people into a lab, assigned them to be a talker, support seeker, or a provider, a listener is what we called them. And then we had them work through their problems, and then we recorded and transcribed them and coded them at the level of terms. And the way we coded support seeking was through the lens of this approach and avoidance. And so approach and avoidance are a very old idea. In fact, it's one of the oldest approaches to looking at coping. We can either turn away from a stressor or we can turn toward it. And so what we did is we operationalized approach, just talking about facts and feelings. So if I'm sharing my problem with you, one of the things I can do to indicate to you that I want to talk about it is I can tell you what happened, talk to you about my feelings. Avoidance, though, if I don't want to talk about it, then I can do things like downplay the problem. I could say, it's not that big of a deal. I don't really care that much. It's not that important. Or even better, I can change the subject. Did you know that, yeah, that happened to me. It sucked, but the Cats play at 4:30. And so I'm really looking forward to that. And I think they're going to win, and so on and so forth. So we coded some other things. I just want to focus on approach and avoidance. But essentially what those two capture is, am I, as a support seeker, moving toward the problem, or am I moving away from it in my talk? So then providers, we coded for person-centeredness, and we've talked about that. We coded whether their utterances denied feelings, whether they implicitly recognize feelings, or we explicitly validated feelings. So we did several different experiments, and what we ended up doing is putting them together to try to figure out this back and forth talk dynamics and how people work together to co-construct supportive interactions. So it's not just somebody giving someone else a message, but we work together collaboratively, interdependently to create support. And so we had 334 dyads. They came into the lab, talked about finances, academics, or relationships. We coded all talk at the level of turns. Conversations had between 1 and 181 turns, and there were about 5,000 total turns. I can talk to you at the end about why we had one with 1 turn. It had to do with some of the things we manipulated in our study. But so what I'm going to show you on the bottom is, some of you might, do we know actor-partner interdependence model? Yeah, of course we do. I think of this this area of campus is the home of the actor-partner interdependence model, right? Because you study families, you study dyads. That's what we in comm love about you all. So this looks like one, right? And it is kind of one. So actor-partner interdependence model have two people, two variables, right? This has two people, one variable, but it's repeated. So that one variable is repeated. It's called a stability influence model. And Dave Kenny and Deborah Cashy came up with it. It's in their book. So what this shows is on the left, we have support seekers message at time 1. And on the right on top, we have support seekers message at now. On the bottom, we have provision message at the last provision message and then the next provision message. What I care about mostly is this influence effect. So what that gets us is when a support seeker says X, when a support provider says X, how does the seeker respond? And when a provider says X, how does when a seeker says X, how does a provider respond? So it actually gets like what happens back and forth in an interaction. If I do this, what do you do in your next turn? So in my mind, it captures this idea of people co-constructing meaning, and it gets averaged across conversations. So then what we found is what we're calling loosely here, vicious and some virtuous cycles. So we found this cycle between approach behavior and person-centeredness where when support seekers used approach behavior, the next response from providers was a higher level of person-centeredness. And you can see in this figure, what the figure in the upper right shows you is it is basically descriptive data of all the turns with the number of turns represented by a point of increasing size. So as more turns are captured by that point, it gets larger. And what we have on the bottom is we have the approach behavior, whether it was present or absent. And what we have up and down on the Y is the level of person-centeredness. And you can see in the further right column, when approach behavior is present, that red, it almost looks like an I, that is a confidence interval with a mean in between. That confidence interval is higher than when approach behavior is absent. So when people used approach behaviors, they got higher levels of person-centeredness in response than when they used avoidance behaviors. So that's part of it, of the influence effect. The other part that we care about is this idea of what happens when providers give different levels of person-centeredness. What does that lead seekers to do? And so we see we get a positive relationship. So when support providers give higher levels of person-centeredness, support seekers are more likely to engage in approach behaviors. And so on the bottom, the figure we have is the axes are just simply flipped. So on the X on the bottom, we have provider person-centeredness. On the Y, up and down, we have whether it's approach behavior or not. And you can see that person-centeredness gets higher further this way in the top portion. So when approach behaviors are present in a turn, when provider person-centeredness is higher, seekers responded with approach behaviors. When provider person-centeredness was lower, seekers were less likely to use approach. So what this tells us, if we put this together, is a cycle, right? So support seekers talk about the problems. Support providers offer higher levels of person-centeredness, person-centered feedback, which in turn leads seekers to talk about the problems, which in turn leads providers to engage in or offer higher person-centered feedback. So you can see how I want to keep coming back to this point that it's not just me giving you high person-centered feedback, but we're working together to produce more productive, supportive conversations. So this is our virtuous cycle. So what this is suggesting then is that, regardless of what the provider wants to do, if the seeker's not into it, they don't want to talk about the problems, then you're probably not going to get very far. So we also found a vicious cycle. And what the vicious cycle involves is when support seekers used avoidance behaviors, they got lower levels of person-centeredness. So we have, and again, in our figure on the bottom is avoidance, whether it was present or absent. That's in our X, our Y up and down. We have person-centeredness. And so what you can see there is that when it's absent, person-centeredness is higher, but when it's present on the right, person-centeredness is lower. So when people used avoidance, they got lower levels of person-centeredness. And then we found, of course, that when providers used lower levels of person-centeredness, avoidance became more likely. So again, we have on the bottom provider person-centeredness, up and down on the Y, we have avoidance, and you can see that when avoidance is present, that confidence intervals to the left, which means lower person-centeredness. So this is our vicious cycle. If someone doesn't want to talk about a problem, they get lower social support, which leads them to not want to talk about the problem. So again, we're working together to co-construct these interactions. So this was one of several studies we ran to try to get at how social support functions in conversations. And in the last 3 to 5 years, there have been a whole number of tools that have come about for looking at support, how conversations unfold. And so I'm not going to get into details here, but here's a study. This is a study where we looked at differences in face-to-face and instant messaging conversations. And we looked at how one person used a certain type of behavior, like talking about feelings, what kind of support they got. And then how, when the provider used a certain kind of support, what kind of support behaviors that led to, and how that was different in face-to-face and CMC. We conducted other work where we tried to capture, we split conversations into quartiles and tried to look at, okay, does approach behaviors occur at different times in conversations? Do avoidance behaviors occur at different times in conversations? And we found, yeah, there was some variation when there's a time in a conversation when these behaviors become more and less likely. Same thing with person-centeredness. We found that higher levels of person-centeredness and low tend to occur later in conversations. So the takeaway here then from this one is that these conversations are products of what I like to call mutual influence. And so mutual influence simply means seekers are affecting providers, providers are affecting seekers, and we're working together to co-construct meaning. So this requires thinking about communication in a different way. It's not an exchange of message where I give you this message and you give me this message, but we actually work together to create meaning through this process of mutual influence. Okay, so the last set of projects I want to talk about look at social support and support provision as a collective practice. So most of the research that has been done on social support assumes dyadic interaction. And by dyads, I just mean two people. The meta-analysis that I talked about was all studied in dyads. Every single one of those studies assumed dyadic interaction. In online settings, though, support is oftentimes collective. So what I mean by that is we have a single support seeker and multiple support providers. And so it becomes a phenomenon where support is multiple people working together to provide aid. Let me give you an example here. This is a fibromyalgia support group. And if people who have fibromyalgia log on to this, and they can ask others who are facing the same condition questions and get feedback. So here at the top, we have Mix It Up Monday is what's called a thread. And that's started by this person, Leo. And Leo's writing to share her feelings. I know I've read a lot of Leo's posts over time because it's featured prominently in our data set. And so Leo, it doesn't matter really what Leo's talking about in terms of the specifics here aren't important. What's important is that Leo kind of gives a deep dive on what's going on in their day, how they're feeling, and so on and so forth. And then Leo gets two responses. And one is from Mickey and the second is from Fantod. And so they are structured so that everyone can see everyone else's participation. So this is what's called the visibility affordance in the CMC literature. So Mickey can see what Leo wrote, Leo can see what Mickey wrote, and then Fantod can see what everybody wrote, because Fantod comes in third in order. And the way this is presented is, I understand you can't read this, that's not the goal. The goal I want to show you is that this is what kind of Leo sees, is that Leo sees their post and then these two responses together. And so what my team and I are arguing is that these aren't separate posts. They are separate posts, but they function together as part of a community support behavior. So rather than being strictly independent, they are a collective and represent a collective kind of support provision practice. And so what we wanted to do is study that and try to better understand how we produce support in these collective type situations. So what we did is we downloaded 33,000 threads from 24 different online health communities. We had about 200,000 total messages. And so we try to get communities with like stigmatized conditions, more stigmatized, less stigmatized, more common, more rare, chronic, acute. We try to capture a whole wide range of communities with the idea that that would be more representative. And then what we did is we coded a sample of messages for emotional support seeking and person-centeredness. And then we use machine learning we train a machine learning model to scale up human coding. So what it essentially does is, as opposed to having a sample of like 1,000, we have a sample of 33,000, which allows us to better identify trends. So one of the things we first did is we only looked at threads in which someone sought emotional support. And so emotional support was defined as threads that included talk about feelings, because in order to help someone feel better, they have to first be feeling something aversive. So this is an example from our data. It says I'm having a small flare, just enough to irritate and interfere with life. I'm in the middle of a yearly SAD attack. It's almost the 1-year anniversary of my sweetie's passing. I am irritable, grumpy, and spoiling for a good argument. Does anyone else get this way? A grumpy, smelly bundle of snippy. So I highlighted in bold all the emotion words. This is a person clearly talking about their feelings. So then what we did is we took all the responses to emotional support seeking messages, and we coded them for person-centeredness. And so we coded, what we ended up with is no low person-centeredness. We had like 4 or 5 messages where they were explicitly denying people's feelings, and all of those were misunderstandings. So this is a good thing, right? Like, it's great that we go onto these online communities and there are no low quality support. That's excellent. From a research perspective, it's not so great. So we would hope to have more variation. What we ended up with, though, is basically 2 levels of moderate and then high. And these 2 levels of moderate are important because they represent different novel rhetorical moves. So level 5 is moderate person-centeredness, and what it captures is a non-specific acknowledgement of feelings. This is, for example, this is from our data. I'm here if you need anything, friend. Level 6 gets at a non-feeling centered explanation, which is like advice. Yeah, definitely don't mess with your meds on your own. Talk to your PDoc about what to do. And then we collapsed all the high into one category. There are actually 3 subcategories. And what those do is explicitly acknowledge feelings. So OMG, I relate to this so much. I understand your lack of feeling fulfilled. I understand relationships feeling exhausting. I definitely understand feeling like you are not a priority in people's lives. So we ended up with these 3 categories across our data. And then what we did is we submitted them to sequence analysis. So what we looked at was for every thread, so for every post from Leo, we looked at the first 3 responses and we had them labeled as being either like level 5, level 6, or high person-centeredness. And so we had these 3 categorical variables, and each of the first 3 posts were labeled. So we submitted that to sequence analysis, and what sequence analysis, it comes out of the research on DNA sequencing, but basically if you have categorical variables, it can tell you how they coalesce into patterns. And what we found is 12 patterns that appeared regularly in the data. I'm not going to get into every single one, but what I want to point out is that in this chart, you see the green is level 5, the purple is level 6, and the orangish, I don't know what color that I'm going to call it orange, is high PC. And so you have the first response here, second response, third response. You can see at the bottom that I pointed to, this is 2 high PCs followed by a level 6. So what I think this shows us is if you think about this system or this community as a dynamic system, they tend to regularly form similar patterns in their responses. And I don't I'm not trying to argue that it's like people are like, hey, you do one and then I'll do one that's level 5, and then somebody else will come in and do a high. I just think this community, this is how they make meaning, right? This is how they come together through talk and create structure. And these are kind of regular patterns in the community. If you're familiar with dynamic systems theory, these what I'm arguing are attractor states. They're regularly appearing states in the community, and they form they have like a gravitational pull that the community tends to return to. So you can see there are a few with level 5, but most of them have some kind of high person-centeredness mixed in. And what we found, more important, not just that there are these regularly occurring patterns, but that these patterns were consequential. So patterns that contain high person-centeredness, what we looked at was, we looked at the first 3 responses. We looked at whether high person-centeredness appeared later in the threads, and we found that threads with high person-centeredness in the first 3, it was also more likely to appear later. The other thing that we found that was a little more compelling was every single person who started a thread was able to rate, self-report their emotional state. So it was like a little button you clicked, and there were 5 responses. They ranged from terrible to great, and they had like little faces associated with them. And so what this allowed us to do is see when a person created a thread, their feeling, we could look at what kind of support they got and then how they felt the next time. So the structure of this online community was very nice because it allowed us to capture change in feelings. And what we found consistently that when these sequences contained high person-centered feedback, that people ended up reporting more positive moods than when they contained lower levels. Now, it wasn't just high person-centeredness is better, but we also found some evidence too that the type of sequence mattered. And I'm not gonna, so what these charts show basically is pairwise differences between the different sequences. So there are 12 sequences on the y-axis, and on what we have on the x's, we have a mood change on the bottom, and on top we have person-centered feedback later in the thread. And my point is not to really get into the weeds on this, but more to point out one combination that stood out to me, or 3 sets, and one in which high PC was important. So combinations that started out with a level 6 response followed by 2 high PCs, so this would be like advice, validation, were more helpful. So they produced more positive self-reported feelings from participants. They also were more likely to generate high PC later than level 6, high PC, or high PC, level 6. I know they don't look very different, right? Look very similar. But starting with level 6 advice and then moving to validation was better than starting with 2 things of advice and then moving to validation, or starting with validation and then moving to advice. And I know, like in other buildings on campus, this is not, this may be like, why does this matter? And this matters because it maps on to what we know about providing effective comforting. What we know about providing effective comforting is you just don't dive in and talk about feelings. You have to get the person to warm up first, is the way they describe it, is making the person, creating a comfortable communication environment is the way it's described in the theory of conversationally induced reappraisals. And so when we start with this level 6, this non-feeling centered talk, it seems like what it's doing is maybe helping this person become more amenable to then receiving specific talk about their feelings with those 2 later high PC responses. So the takeaway here then is that I have argued that this is sort of evidence that support provision can be a group level phenomenon, and that groups, these are all independent actors. They're not working together, but they intentionally they're not working together, but they are as part of community to create meaning, and they converge into these regular patterns of support provision behavior. These group level patterns shape behavior in the community as well as influence the well-being of support seekers. So what I want to try to do now is pull back and say, okay, great. We know all this stuff about support. That's fantastic. What does this mean for kindness? And so what I'd like to try to do is draw some connections and lessons for kindness research. One thing I feel pretty confident about, not because of my research, but because of research on person-centeredness more generally, is that there is a good way and a bad way to provide emotional support. To be kind, emotional support should validate and help a recipient better understand their feelings. So if we're thinking about how can support be kind, we can validate people's feelings. When in doubt, just say, yeah, you have every right to be angry, upset, disturbed, concerned, worried. Those are a lot of words I think that are very prevalent in our society in this very moment. So you have every right to feel that way. Or at the very least, just try not to deny or criticize people's feelings. And I know it's like, that might seem obvious, but I've seen such a tremendous volume of data, and you would not believe the number of people who say, don't worry about it. And they mean well. They mean well. When people say to you, don't worry about it, they mean well, but it's not helpful, right? If you are worried about it and someone tells you not to worry about it, it's not helpful, it denies your feelings. So just simply not denying people's or criticizing feelings would be a great strategy, I think, for being kind.
Not starting sentences with at least.
At least. So, the other couple of things are more things I would encourage folks studying kindness to consider. Kind of like, if things we've learned about support, how can we leverage that to think about how we study kindness? And so one of the things I would encourage you to consider is that kindness is co-constructed. Like, I think kindness probably isn't in the same boat as support, where we think about, I'm going to do a kind act. And it's kind of in isolation. And it's like, there's this person who's the recipient of the kind act, and the action is in the person doing the kind act. I don't know. I think recipients probably play a pretty big role in how kindness works too. And if they haven't, I think it would be great to give them some attention and see, how does kindness really get co-constructed by these participants? How do we have this mutual influence between the person doing the act and the recipient? The other thing I think would be worthwhile is considering kindness as a collective phenomenon. This is the kindness collective after all, right? And so that might mean something like looking at how kindness can emerge out of people acting in concert. So you think about, like, at a grocery store where you see one person helping another, and then another person jumps in, and it's kind of this organic creation of kindness that they don't have a plan in advance to do this, but it's people coming together, all working to achieve this kindness end as a collective or a communal type of effort. So with that, I will thank you all for your kindness, and I will open the floor to any questions that you have.
Actually do have a question, kind of related to the second set of research projects that you were talking about. And I just kind of was curious if you saw or have any insight on when there may be like a misalignment between the seeker and the person providing the support. Mostly I was thinking when potentially the support seeker is using more avoidance and are maybe met with someone giving high person connectedness or something like that. Like,
Yeah.
how they respond, or if that's even received well or maybe poorly.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's part of it. Is in order to validate someone's feelings, they have to talk about their feelings, right? And so if I avoid talking about my feelings, I start talking about the cat's game, and you're like, but it's okay, I'm sorry you feel that way. It's hard to do it.
Yeah.
And so the thing that really struck me is that it puts, in our literature, we're always looking at, like, what messages are helpful to people, but we don't look at how those people end up getting different types based on their behaviors as seekers. And so to me, I've increasingly seen the seekers as being in the driver's seat.
Mm.
And so that also has implications for how we intervene and how we teach people to do support effectively. We also need to teach people how to seek support effectively, I think, is what kind of leads me to.
Thank you.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So I know I'm not an expert on this, but I know we said like avoidance is not as helpful, but I know from like some readings that I've done in emotion regulation work and like distraction as being like somewhat helpful in the short term. So I was wondering if there's any similarities to that, and whether like painting them as like, like let's talk about it, let's talk about it, or like, if they want to talk about that game, and it's okay to like give them a space to talk about it, and want to circle back at the topic a little bit later on, or when things are like really out of control, maybe you want to avoid the topic.
Yeah.
So is it not that helpful to like be avoidant sometimes?
Oh, well, yeah, I hope I didn't portray it that way.
No, you did not. I was perceiving it that way.
Well, no, in our literature, well, so in our society, I think we have this idea that you have to talk about your feelings, you gotta talk about your problems, you have to talk about it. If you don't talk about it, you can't fix it. And, to some degree, there's some merit there, right? But also sometimes people don't want to talk about it, and that's okay too. Topic avoidance can be fine. And so I think that, you're right. Like there are times when distraction is probably a better, if somebody's like ruminating, co-rumination, for example, is something else my team's been studying very recently. Like that's not helpful or healthy.
Yeah.
And so that maybe avoidance might be better. And so I think that that's why I'm kind of was poking fun at the idea of a vicious cycle, because it may be that when I think what was happening is when people were avoiding changing the subject, what was happening and getting coded as lower person centeredness was the support provider was also getting off topic.
Got it.
So what was happening in these conversations is the provider was getting like dinged for low person centeredness because they were talking about their own thing. So like what would happen would be they'd start talking about vacations or something because the seeker would be clearly uncomfortable, not want to talk about it. The provider didn't want to push them. And so they ended up doing this vicious cycle, but they were really ended up just not talking about the problem and talking about others. They were talking about the game, for example.
Got it.
So it can be good. I have some misgivings about these virtuous, vicious labels, but they sound nice and they both start with V. So we got alliteration going. You know how important that is in academic research.
No, it's great. Sorry, can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
In a therapeutic context, if they're like being avoidant, and then can the support seeker then continuously push for them to talk about the feeling? I mean, like, the game is great, but like, it's okay to talk about our feelings, let's do that. Like, have you had a chance to like look at the literature on that, and like, what happens if they do that on a constant level? Would the support seeker then turn from an avoidant perspective to an approach perspective? Does that happen if the person who's giving the support encourages the talking of the feelings?
So I should add though a caveat that all my research is what it's sometimes called troubles talk. It's between everyday people talking about like everyday problems. And so you're kind of almost getting into like clinical psych stuff, which is a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I would assume it's totally appropriate for a provider because that's a different kind of context and setting where that you're coming to that provider for assistance. So if they're pushing you back to topic, that's reasonable. But if it's like two friends at a coffee shop talking about everyday stressors or even significant stressors in their lives, it may not be helpful.
Got it. Perfect. Thank you.
Great questions, though.
I have follow-up to the follow-up to the follow-up. Thinking about, do these people know, like, does the support provider know that the person has something going on?
Yeah, so in the lab, basically, we told them, you're going to be a listener, you're going to be a talker, and then here's some of the topics. Are you willing to talk about? And they said yes. And so we told them that they would talk about academics or finances or relationships.
Right. So the support provider then, if the support seeker is avoiding and not actually seeking, and they're talking about the game, you could argue that it would be kind to sort of go with them, right? Talking about the game as that warm up that you described, warm into it and then build this sort of rapport or trust with the person that they then might turn to you. That idea of not jumping, not going 0 to 60 on the talk.
Yeah, and I should add too that in these experiments, we manipulated some things. We held constant in the data I showed you, but for other studies, one of the things we manipulated was like the degree to which you as a seeker thought your face was going to be threatened. So we told the seekers that either we told them nothing or we primed them and said the provider is probably going to look down upon you for this problem. And so that's why we had the interaction that was only one turn.
Gotcha.
People were just like, I'm going to not do it. I'm going to get out of here.
Right.
So they had reason to, that also helped create variance though. So they had reason to like avoid.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Sure.
This is kind of zooming out from your specific research, but I think about like in HDFS, like the relationship between like personality and like communication, or personality and like behavior, for example. And so I was curious for you, do you think that there's a relationship between like anxiety or worry and like some of these communication patterns that emerge? And if that's like rooted in like someone's like innate kind of temperament, or if it's like more environmental, like, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Can I say the A word? Attachment?
Yeah.
I love it. That's what I love the family studies folks. Yeah, it's great. And just what I mean by that is we are, I love the family studies folks, and I love the social psych folks, and the social folks too, because we're all working on the same thing, but we're coming at it from a slightly different lens. And that's why I love having to talk to you all, because you help me see things, and hopefully we help you all see things. I've not thought about that, but that is absolutely fascinating to look at like some individual differences, and like especially like with something with attachment, because you can kind of see how people with certain types of attachment may be more inclined to avoid, right? Yeah. So there, and I've put my lens over conversation. I'm really interested in what got me interested as an undergraduate is how people make meaning through talk, come together. You say this, I say this, and we come to this shared understanding. But you all are coming at it from a different lens. And so you could put that lens over a little bit greater time period and say, well, can we find out that people with certain attachment styles are more likely to avoid over time, and really get some cool stuff too. And so I see us all on team kindness or team social support, and we're just playing different roles in that team. And so I think that's absolutely fascinating. And I'd love for you all to kind of take on this task with through your unique lens. Sure.
That's a question that's related to that, but thinking about individual differences on the other side. So to what extent are there people who just are almost always high on the person-centered, or is it kind of contextually driven?
So so there are really very few studies on that. We have one where, so I showed you the data from the support communities. That gave us also is data on people providing support over time. We did find intra-individual variability, and we found what it was based upon was what they were getting out of the community. So it was weird. It was like the very most active people were some of the meanest. Because I think what happened was the people who use the community infrequently, I think they had like this generic script for what they should be doing. They were also more likely to be influenced by the norms of others in the community. So like if everybody else in the thread before them gave high person-centeredness, they parroted it. But the people who are more active seem to be more discerning. And so they were like, you're not really worthy of the really high stuff. I'm going to just give you the moderate stuff. So yeah, there is at least in the data we saw from online community members, there was this intra and individual variability. It's also why I love the family studies research that I read, is because you all are like really tuned into that. And I think that is awesome. Seriously, I really like the overtime with in person. Yeah, it's great. Not all of you, but those of you who are, I think you are awesome.
The first project, do you consider like tonality, or like making the AI voice sound more human, and then like kind of making it sound kind of sarcastic? So like you can say positive words or high PC words, but like oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
What a good step.
Yeah.
So we had no voice. It was just text coming out.
So then could the person probably like interpret it like sarcastic, but then
Yeah. But actually, to be honest with you, I think that they started to get angry in some of the responses later
like
on.
after a while.
Yeah, like there was some profanity and some listener bot, you suck, but they said it in a much more colorful way. Yeah. And I didn't love doing that project because I felt like it was kind of yucky to like do that. Yucky is an academic word. But you know, as I mentioned, like, this is the way people talk to one another in everyday life. And so it is important to, you know, get that information out. And then we also thoroughly debrief them. Yeah, but tonality would be really cool. How it's delivered is something we have not looked at and there's no research on, but it would be valuable to have.
I'm amazed with the high person-centeredness of ChatGPT.
I was actually trying to get it to produce low and it wouldn't. It said something to the effect of like, I'm not designed to be mean or I won't be mean.
Yeah.
It really was, because I was actually trying to get it to come up with messages to use for something, and it wouldn't do it.
You ever just need a kind response, just put it into ChatGPT.
That's true.
It is true. I've tried it.
Good question.
Yeah, for the online community space project, unless I'm misunderstanding, was that the community spaces that you guys were using for data, was that all specific to chronic illness or was there variation?
They were all illness communities. Some were chronic, some were acute. So we had things ranging from like smoking cessation. We had some really rare stuff. I'm trying to think about, but then we had like more and less stigmatized things. Migraine was one, tinnitus was one, a whole range. We tried to get as many as that. We tried to cover as much ground as we could.
I was just curious because I think you had said that there was like very few low person-centered responses. And I was thinking about like other online spaces and how maybe like that would look different in other community forums. And I'm thinking of like TikTok, so it's like not a community forum, but people going on there and talking about their experiences with like racism and the comments. Yes, you have a lot of people also validating, but you also have a lot of people in the comments invalidating those experiences. So I was curious how your findings might look different in like different community threads.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing next, is we're trying to find forums where they have low person-centeredness. I wanted to get Nextdoor, from a Nextdoor. It's like an app you can use and that has a local community built in. They are mean on there. Anytime someone is like, my car was broken into, I feel terrible. And then people are like, you should have locked it up. It's your fault for leaving it on. I mean, there's a lot of victim blaming and things that would be very low person-centered. But also like Reddit and other spaces. That's actually the next thing we're working on, is to explicitly find spaces for low person-centeredness for sure. And see how that affects the vitality of the community.
Last call for questions. All right, well, thank you so much. This was
Yeah.
terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
all for joining us.